You wake up at 3 a.m. and your heart is already pounding. The room is still. Nothing moved. But something ancient inside you decided, in this quiet darkness, that you needed to be ready. What if that instinct was not just biology? What if it was memory? Not your memory. The memory of a civilization that understood the human mind thousands of years before the rest of the world had a name for it. Your ancestors knew what was happening inside you, and they built entire systems of knowledge around it. This is the story of how African civilization mapped the human mind first. Long before European universities existed, long before Sigmund Freud published a single word, long before the term neuroscience was coined in any Western institution, the ancient Egyptians were writing detailed accounts of the brain, the nervous system, and the relationship between the mind and human survival. They were not guessing. They were documenting. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated to approximately 1600 BCE, but believed to be copied from an even older source, around 3000 BCE, contains the first written description of the brain in human history. Read that again. The first. Not Greek, not Roman, not European. African. Written by African physicians in the Nile Valley, this document uses the word brain for the first time in any recorded language. It describes the meninges, the protective membranes surrounding the brain. It describes the cerebrospinal fluid. It describes how injuries to specific parts of the brain affect specific parts of the body on the opposite side. A concept called contralateral function that Western medicine would not formally document again for nearly 3,000 years. These were not primitive observations. This was a precise, empirical, systematic study of the human mind conducted by African scholars at a time when the civilizations that would later claim to have invented science were not yet born. But the ancient Egyptians did not stop at anatomy. They understood something even deeper. They understood the connection between the mind, fear, survival, and the spirit. And they built a framework for that understanding that was extraordinarily sophisticated. In Kemetic philosophy, the spiritual and intellectual tradition of ancient Egypt, the heart was understood as the seat of intelligence, emotion, and moral reasoning. This was not metaphor. This was neuroscience expressed in the language available to them. What they called the heart, they meant the mind, the seat of what you feel, what you remember, what you fear, and what gives you courage. They understood that the body and the mind were not separate, that what you experienced, the sudden freeze when danger appeared, the racing pulse, the heightened senses, was the whole self responding as one integrated system. Modern science now calls this the autonomic nervous system. Your ancestors called it the wisdom of the body, and they mapped it through thousands of years of careful observation and healing practice. The Ebers Papyrus, another African medical document dating to around 1550 BCE, describes what we now recognize as psychological and emotional conditions: depression, anxiety, states of overwhelming fear, and it prescribes treatments, not magical incantations alone, but a combination of plant medicine, therapeutic conversation, community ritual, and what we would today recognize as mindfulness practices. They understood that the mind needed to be treated with the same seriousness as the body. They understood that unresolved fear lived in the body and had to be addressed through the body. Your ancestors were not waiting for Western psychology to explain them. They had already built the map. And their understanding did not stay inside Egypt. It traveled. The knowledge systems of the Nile Valley spread throughout the African continent and across the ancient world. Greek scholars, including Hippocrates, who is credited in Western textbooks as the father of medicine, traveled to Egypt to study. Pythagoras studied in Egypt. Plato studied in Egypt. Aristotle is believed to have drawn extensively from the libraries of Alexandria, the greatest repository of African and ancient world knowledge ever assembled. The knowledge moved. The credit did not always follow. But what matters for you right now is this: the framework your nervous system still runs on, the threat detection system, the survival memory, the mind-body connection that fires when you wake at 3 a.m. with your heart pounding. That framework was first understood, first mapped, and first treated by African minds, by your ancestors. There is a practice that traces back to ancient African healing traditions that modern neuroscience has only recently validated. It involves controlled breathing, communal gathering, rhythmic movement, and intentional sound. These were not recreational activities. They were technologies, precision tools developed over centuries for regulating the nervous system, for moving a person from the state of threat activation back to a state of safety and presence. The drum was not just music. The rhythm of the drum, specifically the low-frequency rhythmic patterns used in traditional African ceremony, has been shown in modern research to synchronize brainwave activity, lower cortisol levels, and activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the same system your body needs to access in order to come down from a threat response. Your ancestors engineered that. They understood, through observation and practice across generations, that certain sounds at certain rhythms could reach inside the human nervous system and return it to balance. They built the technology of healing the mind centuries before the Western world acknowledged that the mind needed healing. Consider the Ubuntu philosophy, originating in the Bantu-speaking cultures of sub-Saharan Africa and expressed in the phrase often translated as "I am because we are." This was not simply a social principle. It was a neurological insight. Your ancestors understood, long before John Cacioppo's research on loneliness at the University of Chicago confirmed it, that the human nervous system is a social organ, that it does not regulate itself in isolation, that the presence of your people, your community, your belonging is not a luxury. It is medicine. It is the primary input your threat detection system needs in order to rest. They built entire societies around that understanding, not because it was idealistic, because it was true, because they had watched, over generations, what happened to people who were separated from community, and what happened when they were returned to it. This is your inheritance, not a vague pride in ancient monuments, a specific, documented, extraordinary legacy of intellectual and scientific achievement in understanding the very thing that makes you human, your mind. The next time your heart pounds in the dark, you are not experiencing a malfunction. You are running the most ancient and sophisticated survival intelligence on Earth. An intelligence first understood by African physicians who pressed their hands to the skull of a patient and wrote, for the first time in human history, the word brain. They saw you coming. They mapped the territory. And they left the knowledge behind for you to find your way back to yourself. You were never without a framework. You were only without the history that told you who built it. Now you know.